Okay.
Sure the audio is recording.
Yeah, it should be. I mean, I tested it before. Okay, so here we are in our source folder. So I've got it open in my editor. Oh god, this is gonna be large. Okay, so this is the app.py folder file that we're working on last time, and this is the DB file that was updated on Piazza. So everybody should download this and put this in their source folder in the same place as their app. So when we start development, we always want to activate the virtual environment. And I've already got all the requirements installed, I hope. So from last time, we can just Python to Python 3 to run the app. And so we want to integrate the database this time. Last time we just have this hard-coded tasks thing, and these just update that. So what we want to do is we can go into the database db.py first. We provided a lot of the starter code for you, and there's a few to-dos here, and we can just fill them in right now. If you take a look at this example create table, this is basically the same thing as what we saw just now in the lecture. And so we want to adapt this to work for our use case, which is to-dos, which have an ID, which will be auto-generated, and a description. Oh yeah, sure. So our to-dos have an ID, a description, and a done field. In this DB class that we've given you, so we've got something called the connection object, which is how we access the database through Python. It uses the SQLite3.connect method, which you don't really need to worry about the semantics. You just need to know that this here, right here, is our table name. And then we can use that later on to make queries to the database. Database name, sorry. And we want to, so here we call example create table. So you can see that we run Python app.py. It says table example already exists because I've run it a few times, but if we jump into our database here and we run .tables to show tables, we got our example table, which is, yeah. Okay.
And you also need to tell me
Yeah, we'll do. Yeah, so here we've got our examples table in our SQLite command line. And so if we want to start implementing, we want our task table, my Python offset is not great. Okay. So we want to do the same thing that we did for the example table. So we can just copy this over, and we want to change up the fields to match our tasks. So here we've got create table, just like in the lecture. And instead of example, we'll call the table task. And then we still want a primary key that is an ID and integers, and that gets auto-generated. And instead of a name, we want something like a description. Still not null, which means that it can't be an empty. And finally, we want a done field, which is going to be whether our task is complete or not. So if we look back at our app.py, that's pretty much exactly how these tasks are laid out, just with capital letters. Okay, so done is a Boolean type, true or false. Here's a comment.
around.
So that's our create task table. And it's pretty much exactly the same as the example create table, so we can just remove that line and try running the create task table instead. And if we wrote that correctly, yeah. So I actually did this before, but so our app started like this. What we want to do to run the database is, or to integrate the database into our app, is we want to import the DB. So from the DB file, import the DB class. Then the terminology is going to get a little confusing because there are going to be 3 different DBs. But here we're just going to instantiate the DB object as just like that. Does anyone have any questions? Has everybody downloaded the DB file?
Has anyone run into any problems so far with this? Yeah. Oh, I'll go.
Okay. Are there any other questions right now? Can you raise your hand if you haven't gotten the DB file yet? Okay. Can everyone who's caught up at this point also raise their hand? Okay, great. Okay. Okay, we can continue then. Everything good, Megan? Okay. So we can exit out of that. We're still here. So now that we've integrated our database into app.py and we've added create task table instead, we can try running the app again. And this time it'll say table task already exists. This is a little quirk with debug mode, but we don't really need to worry about that. So now if we go into todo.db, we can show tables, and now we've got a task table also. And if we try to look at what's in it, there's going to be nothing because we haven't done anything with it yet. But theoretically, we could insert and delete just from the command line. Yeah, so that shows the tasks, the columns of our tables. And we've got our primary key ID, our description, and our done, just like we created right here. And so we can also really quickly implement the deletion of the task table. So to do anything with the database, we need to call a method of self.con execute, which just runs a SQL query. And this query is pretty simple. It's just drop table, and we can add something like an existence clause to make sure the table exists when we try to drop it. And it's just that. And if we try to run that when we instantiate the database also, here it is again, in case you need it. So if we try to run that, and then we look in again, yeah, there's no more task table. We've deleted it. So we don't actually want to do that because we want to use the table. So let's get rid of that line. And now we can move on to actually implementing some of the routes in our database. So the first one we've got here is get tasks. Yeah, it's mostly readable. It's a little cut off, but okay. So in order to do get tasks, we can create a new method here. And all we want to do is execute the select query that we learned about earlier on our tasks table. So again, we use the execute, and our query is going to look like okay. So this is a little different because this method call it actually gives you something back. So in order to actually get that data, we're going to have to take the return from the return value from this function, and we're going to assign it to something called a cursor. And this cursor is basically like, it's something called an iterator, and allows you to go through the results that you got from the database. So if we want to return our tasks, a list of tasks in the end. So the simple way to do this is the cursor is, well, basically you can use a for loop to go through and check all the rows that get returned from that query. So we can do for row in cursor to iterate through it, and then we can simply, so the structure of this row, we can just take a look. So I'm going. Okay. Yeah. So we can quickly. We need a value in the table to see it.
Oh, we can do that later.
Okay. Sure. Okay. Well, in any case, we can keep this. We will know that this row is going to be the task that we want. So we can come back to that later. And in order to actually see the results from that function, we can implement the create route. So this one will actually take an argument, description and done, because that's all we need to instantiate a task. So we need to do this. We also need to instantiate a cursor object because we need to, we need to both create the object and tell the database that we created the object in something called a commit. So we'll execute. We can also execute on cursors. So here we can execute the query that we want. So we do insert into the task table and then the columns description and done. And then after that, we want to specify the values to insert. And the special syntax for this is we can put 2 question marks here. And then as a second argument to our execute function, we can put in a Python tuple of the 2 things we want to substitute in for the question marks. So here it's just going to be description and done. There we go. Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. And so now that we've executed something on the cursor, we want to tell the connection, okay, I'm done doing my thing here. I'm going to commit, which is just fancy CS terminology for save. And okay, yeah, and then in order to, after we've inserted, we just in case we want to know like what the ID of that newly created task is, we can use a special fields called last row ID, which is pretty self-explanatory. It's the ID of the last row created. And since we just inserted this, that will be the last row created. So here's our create task method. I'm going to call create task in our constructor. And description, let's say sleep. And the done is false. So we're going to create the task table, and it'll probably print a message because it exists already. And we're going to create a sleep task, and then we're going to run our get all tasks function that we wrote before. But that doesn't really do anything yet. It's just going to print the tasks. So try to run app.py. We've been dated ID. Clearly you do. Did I do primary key? I think so. I copied it. Okay, so we'll try that again. No, it still says not null constraint. Yeah, because it's expecting an ID. Is there a setting we need to auto-populate the ID? It probably is. I don't think that's. Check over here. Create check. Okay, that's kind of weird. But in the meantime, we can just. Should we just create an ID incrementer?
Or you can explain this, like all.
What? I wanted to have a task to insert first.
I guess you can do it.
Okay, I'm going to put a quick ID here of 0, just so we can see what happens. And it's not called tasks. Where did I say tasks? Here. It's called task. Lowercase task. Hold on a second. Just gonna, okay, so there we go. We've printed out here the value of that one thing. And if we go into our database, we show our tables, we got our task table. We can select all from the task table, and it shows in a as just the ID and then the description and then done, which is a boolean, but it's false. So false is 0 and true is 1 in SQLite. That is super weird. I'm pretty sure. So I just put in the ID to make it work. Yeah, yeah, it's the same thing. It's weird. It might be a SQLite setting. Yeah. I mean, I downloaded it from Piazza. Okay. So I'm just going to do a quick workaround for that, I guess. We can get the last row ID plus 1. Okay. Has anybody else tried this with no ID and had it work? Or is this just my computer thing? I'm going to try that. Like that's going to be the last thing, yeah. So I think that should also work. Unless it's not. Okay. That's so annoying. Okay, in any case, we've seen that the row has the things that we want. So what we can do is instead of printing out the row contents, we're going to want to populate our little tasks list here. So we can append to our task list object, and that object is going to have ID, which is going to be the first thing row. Row here is going to be a tuple, a 3 tuple, which has our ID as the first thing, description as the second thing, and done as third thing. And 0 index, so it's 0, 1, and 2. And so now tasks is going to be a list. And if we go back into our, I'll leave this up for a second. Yeah, it's literally the same thing. Just Google like SQLite doesn't auto-generate ID. Okay, try it out. Yeah. Generate ID picture. I have to recreate it. Remove the ID thing. work?
I think so.
Okay, I think that worked. Yeah, so the problem that we just encountered there was that the ID wasn't getting auto-populated, and that's because we had a different type. We used int primary key, and apparently integer and int are different. So in order to get the auto-incrementing field, the one that auto-populates when you add a new row to the table, you need to say integer primary key. Okay, so we've done that, and now that works. So we can go, we've implemented our get all and our create tasks, which means, yeah, which means we can adjust our routes now to do that. So we can get rid of the tasks and the task ID counter from before. And here, instead of doing the data as a list of tasks.values, we can just call our function from get all tasks. And similarly, we can, instead of doing this logic, we can do db.createTask, and we pass in the description and the default value of done, which is false. Yeah, and this is going to be the task ID. And should we just return the ID?
No, we return the task we just created. Something like this.
Okay. Yeah, so in order to, the task that we just created is going to look something like this. So this way we can still return the task as before. Let's see Python. Okay. We can get rid of our global calls and comment out the rest. So now if we run our server, we can go to Postman and try running our get all tasks. And there we go. We sleep twice apparently. So we've got 2 sleep to-dos in our list, and say we want to create a new task. That is not sleep this time. This time we do our laundry. So we send this, and it says success. We've created a laundry task with ID 3. That's really hard to read. There we go. So that's got a new ID, and if we try to send our get all tasks again, now we have 3 tasks, and one of them is going to be laundry. Yeah, and so if we close the server down and we start it again, because we persisted it in our database file, we can send the request again, and it's still got, well, it added another sleep because that's part of our initialization. But you ideally wouldn't do that. And then all of the ones from before are still going to be there. So that allows us to keep our data independently from the server. Yeah. So we can go ahead and remove that creation of a task here, and also that. Yeah, and the last thing we can do is write one of the other routes, which is the next one here, get task a specific ID. So in order to do that, we're going to write a new method in our database that takes a task ID, and we want to again execute a select query from the task table, but this time we want a condition. We want one where the ID is equal to a given argument. And we're going to use the same syntax again, the question mark, and we're going to pass in the task ID. Yeah. Yeah, so you have to make sure you have this trailing comma, because in Python, if you don't have that comma, your tuple turns back into a normal value. but you need to make sure this is just a tuple of one thing. Okay, so include this comma here and the parentheses. That's all really important. Yeah, and again, we want to assign this to cursor, and this will return a bunch of results. Technically, we know that it's going to return at most one because we're looking at ID here, and ID is a primary key. But we can still iterate through the cursor to get the results of our select query. And this may return nothing if the ID doesn't exist in the table. But if it does, we can return our task. And then if we get outside the for loop, that means the query returned nothing, so there were no rows in the cursor, which means we're going to return Python's none. And finally, we can go into app.py, and here, instead of getting task ID, we can simply make the database call. And check if task is none. If it's none, we're going to return our false route, and otherwise we'll return our true. And so we can try that out. And Postman also. So we want to get task with ID, say 4. So we're going to change in the URL parameter, and send this task. And we've got one of our sleep tasks here with ID 4. And if we try a task with an ID that doesn't exist, we'll get an error, and the task is not found. Is that all we want to cover?
Does anyone have any questions? So we're not going to cover how we do update tasks or delete tasks since one, we're short on time, but also it's very similar to like getting a task or creating a task. The syntax is very similar, so you can use like what we have as a baseline, and I'll be posting the slides, which has all the SQL syntax that you'll need for this assignment. And then you can always post questions on Piazza or come to office hours if you have any questions. But yeah, that's it for today.